Why didn't Bronze Age swords like these have more hand protection on them like later periods of swords did? Well, we're going to look at some probable reasons and one possible bit of conjecture, which might be another reason why these had such tiny hand protection. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. So these are two beautiful replica Bronze Age swords, late Bronze Age swords made by Neil Burridge of Bronze Age Swords. And I was pondering something while sort of training with one of these and conjecturizing, essentially why does it have such tiny hand protection? And moreover, extrapolating why do Bronze Age swords in general have such small amount of hand protection. Now, I should mention before I dip into this that actually some Bronze Age swords actually do have a bit more hand protection than others, and some of them do have the beginnings of crossguards. We're going to talk about those in a second and why they might have them and these might not, or most examples from the Bronze Age don't. But we're also going to look at the end at a possible reason why Bronze Age swords didn't have as much hand protection as later periods of sword. Now, for full historical context, just very briefly, it is fair to say that there are lots of other swords from history and weapons from history which don't have much hand protection. In fact, some of them have almost none, whether it's a Burmese dart or a kukri like this. Even the Roman gladius and Sparta don't really have very much hand protection. We've looked at this in previous videos, and what we find is as we get into, at least in Europe anyway, into the Dark Ages, not a popular term these days, but let's call it early medieval period, we start to get slightly longer extensions on guards. We've talked about this in the past, and it obviously, at least to me anyway, it seems obvious, relates to the types of shields being used. And that's almost certainly extrapolating back, relevant to the Bronze Age as well. So the basic premise that I've set up in previous videos is that we start to see guards get longer once there is a general move from boss gripped shields like this, which covers your hand when you're attacking, because when your shield is extended and your sword is extended, your hand is hidden behind the line of the shield. And I pointed out that once we start to get into the medieval era, and we start to get into strapped shields like this, it means that your hand will naturally extend beyond the distance, at least more of the time, beyond the distance of the edge of your shield, which means that your hand becomes more vulnerable. And we, at the exact same time, around 1000 AD, we start to move towards strapped shields and gradually away from boss grip shields. We start to see that cross guards get longer. Now, if we refer to this as frog DNA, so Jurassic Park reference there, and extrapolate back, because of course the Bronze Age is a period, unlike the medieval period where we have fighting manuals or treatises, so we've got written descriptions of these swords being used, we've got lots of art, everything from tapestries through to frescoes, through to manuscripts. So we've got a lot more archaeology as well. We've got loads of stuff to go on when we're looking at the medieval period. But when we're looking at the Bronze Age, we don't have all of that. We've really only got archaeology. So we've got some skeletons. Yeah, we've got some lots of actually bronze swords, the artifacts, but we don't have any written sources, at least for most of Europe, describing how combat actually went. And certainly even the descriptive sources that we have from later on don't really go into the real technical detail of how these things were used. So we have to use what we refer to as experimental archaeology. So when we're looking at HEMA sources from later medieval period, it can be useful when coming back from the periods that we know more about, the medieval period, to come back and apply it to the use of these weapons. So what can we learn? Well, one of the main things is about shields. So what were Bronze Age shields like? Well, bear in mind that the Bronze Age isn't just one place and one period of time. It's actually a very long period of time, very long compared to the medieval period in Europe. And moreover, it covers all of Europe. So shields weren't the same all over Europe for the whole of that time, obviously. Okay. However, in Northern Europe, where swords like this were predominantly used, and indeed this carp's tongue, so the different varieties, but they share some features, a lot of design features, we actually find that it seems one of the most common types of shield actually wasn't that different from what I'm holding here. So it does seem that there was a general tendency to go from boss grip shields that looked somewhat like this, probably smaller than this on average, probably like 2/3 the size of this Viking era shield. But basically, functionally very similar. In fact, we actually find bronze ones surviving. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether the bronze ones are purely ceremonial or ritual, or whether they're actually used. In fact, one of the examples actually has weapon damage on it, which has been repaired, which would suggest that they were actually used. But I wouldn't suggest that all the shields being used were bronze, because I would say they definitely weren't. So what were the other shields like? Well, we assume that they were organic material versions of the bronze ones. So essentially they are round shields with a grip in the middle, with a boss on the front. We don't really know that much about the bosses either, actually. So it could have been the entire shield was made of wood and hide and organic materials in most cases. So we essentially have a boss gripped shield. And that means that some of the rules of why you don't have much hand protection on a Bronze Age sword are exactly the same, probably, that would be what I'd put my money on, to the Viking era swords, because, and same thing with Roman, because fundamentally if you've got a boss gripped shield that you extend with your attacks and you extend out from your body, it covers the line to your hand, and therefore your Bronze Age sword, like that, doesn't really necessarily need a lot of hand protection because it's always behind the shield. Now, I mentioned that not all Bronze Age shields were the same, of course. There were a great variety of different types of shields used in different parts of Europe at different times by different tribal peoples, different kingdoms, during what we call the Bronze Age. However, there is something interesting to note, and that is there was a tendency, particularly in Northern Europe, to move towards more oblong shaped. This is obviously a Roman scutum, but it's the closest thing I've got. More oblong shaped, elongated shields in the real late Bronze Age, and into the Iron Age, in fact, that were oblong shaped and were boss gripped. However, they were boss gripped this way horizontally, which gives you a very different type of shield usage. It means that in standard carry, it might be close to your body down here instead of extended out like the Viking era shield. Yes, you can extend it out. We know that the Romans did this in combat. We can see from gladiatorial art and other kind of Roman art that shows it being used like that. We also know with later medieval shields as well that they were used similarly. So it does, however, mean that when you've got a larger, heavier shield that perhaps you're holding closer to your body, the arm may well extend beyond the shield in a similar way to the strap shield. Now, what's interesting is we actually start to see in some places, particularly in parts of Germany, for example, and what's now France, we do actually see late forms, before we get into the Iron Age, late forms of bronze sword that do extend further out here, so they do protect the hand more. Possibly that's related to the changing shield shape. Now, another interesting parallel with the medieval period is another place we start to see these extend out into little crossguards, essentially, a little bit like the Viking era sword, is in fact in the Aegean and in Greece. In fact, predecessors of what later evolve into the xiphos, for example, in Greece, the famous hoplite sword in the Iron Age. But we start to see these Aegean bronze swords with extensions here, little either straight or sometimes hooked upwards, that are very clearly hand protection, exactly like on early medieval swords. And what's interesting is this is a period in which they're potentially moving to forms of shield which are, again, bigger, held closer to the body, and in some cases strapped. So instead of holding the shield out here as you're striking, it might now be a lot closer to the body here, and so you're extending the hand beyond, and you need better hand protection on the sword. So again, I think this aligns with my theory about how the hand protection is very closely tied to the size, shape, weight of shield and the way you hold it, or it might be attached to your arm. So these are the conventional, or at least according to me, Matt Easton, these are the conventional explanations, I think, and probably the largest and most important explanations of why we have so little hand protection on Bronze Age swords, because it's connected to the type of shield used, how it's used, and also later on when we get different types of shields, we start to see, indeed, hand protection start to develop on specific types of Bronze Age sword, even if it wasn't common on most bronze swords. So now we'll look at a slightly different take on it. Why else might Bronze Age swords not have generally needed any more than just a little bit of a lip like that? Well, the first point to return to is that a lot of swords throughout history haven't really had much hand protection on them. So, and you know, an axe or a mace doesn't have any hand protection on it. A standard knife doesn't have any hand protection on it. A spear doesn't have any hand protection on it. So just because we're used to later periods of sword which have more hand protection, we should try not to let us bias that in the context of the time. Because if you live in an age where the other weapons on offer might be an axe, a stone-headed mace, a spear, well, none of them have hand protection. So when you have a sword, why would you put hand protection on that? Because the other ones don't have hand protection either. So that's the first thing. The first thing is that hand protection wasn't yet the norm, okay? So much like inventing the wheel or anything else, if it's not normal, well then you don't put it on your sword. So I think that's a really important point to make. But it was also worth mentioning that even these swords which have minimal hand protection on them do have a little bit. Now, the other way to look at this is hand protection isn't always there to protect you from the opponent's weapon. Again, I think because we come from a context of knowing what medieval knights' swords or rapiers or whatever look like, we know about later periods, so we therefore make assumptions about earlier periods of weapon where they didn't yet know about that technology. But in this case, this is not necessarily primarily there to protect your hand from the opponent's weapon. There are two other really important things that achieves. One, probably the most important one, is to stop your hand sliding onto the blade. Now, I mentioned axes and maces don't have hand protection, but if we grab an axe over here, for example, if my hand slips on this axe shaft, it doesn't do me any harm. It's not really a big problem. Whereas if we didn't have any hand protection here at all to stop my hand going up and it slips onto the blade, what happens is actually what happens in a lot of modern crime where people stab other people with kitchen knives, that they get a cut hand because the knife's not designed for that. And in fact, it is one of the things you have to bear in mind when using types of knife or dagger which don't really have hand protection on them, whether it's a shashka, a kukri or whatever. You have to bear in mind that if you were stabbing with it, your hand might carry upwards, and so we have things like the ribs on the grip to prevent that happening. So coming back to the Bronze Age sword, that's primarily there to protect your hand from your own blade, okay? But there is a second really important thing this achieves. You will notice that these guards, even though they're very, very small, they do project out forwards of the fingers. And we know that in this period, the predominant thing used with a sword is a shield. And one of the things, as soon as you start sword and shield fighting, is you'll notice your hand often smashes into either your or the opponent's shield. Sometimes other things like a spear shaft or whatever, their helmet if they've got one or whatever. So having a little bit of projection at the top of here also helps protect your knuckles a little bit from impacting things. But to finish off, I want to give you two other reasons why I think Bronze Age swords didn't have, and in most cases probably didn't need, any real hand protection, apart from everything else that's gone before, which are the primary points. But here are some others. So first of all, we're quite used to a world, again I mentioned about trying not to make assumptions based on later periods of history. So we're quite used to assuming that if someone swings a weapon at us like this, then we can form a parry by putting the sword in the way. Now, one of the problems, and I'll do this gently because I don't want to damage the swords, and they are sharp, is that if you parry upwards here, the blade slides downwards, okay? Or does it? We'll come to that in a second. So assuming it slides down your blade, that is exactly why we have things like this crossguard. It means that I can form a parry on either side, and if the blade slides down, it stops on the guard. Great, but what if the guard isn't there? Well, that might tell us something about their swordsmanship. So I would suggest, and bear in mind, they're not always going to have a shield. The shield might be broken, dropped, whatever. If a person is having to interpose their weapon, and we do have lots of Bronze Age swords with edge damage on them from other swords. We'll talk about that more in a second. We would not defend like this. And there are two other main ways in historical European martial arts that you can defend against, for example, a downwards blow. So if we assume the opponent is doing what is the most common cut, which is or blow is downwards from their dominant side, even in modern crime with stabbings and bottles and everything else, this is the most common blow, downwards from their dominant side, down from here. So it's the blow we spend most of our time training against. There are two other ways of dealing with it rather than interposing with a parry that in sabre would be known as high cart. Instead of that, we can do what's called a hanging guard. That means putting the blade in that way. You'll notice that I also turned the flat, but you could do it with the edge. It's done both ways in different systems and different places, different times. So instead of putting it point up, we put it point down. The beauty of that is when their blade now hits our blade, if it slides, it will slide away and downwards away from the hand. So not only will it be away from the hand, be away from our body, so we're putting it up like a covering roof. This would be called prime in modern sabre. In fact, it's still a completely currently used parry, and it's very advisable in stick fighting systems to parry like that as well, for the same reason, because with a stick it slides away from your hand instead of into your hand. Okay? Right, so that's the first way, is just to parry with the blade the other way around. The other thing you can do, and this is going to be a little bit difficult to demonstrate without a training partner, which I don't have around at the moment, is what's called a beat. Okay, so if a person gives a blow down here, we are currently thinking about stopping it. Okay, we don't want to do the point up, and we've decided the point down works pretty well, but there's another option. So if a blow is moving with this angle, if we hit it from above, or we hit it from below, it diverts it, okay? So even if we look at as late as things like Marozzo, for example, 1536, with a side sword, he does these actions. So if a blow's coming down here, you can hit with your back edge underneath their blade, and it will knock their blade off to the side. So as it comes down here, I traverse this way, smack off to the side, and then cut down into the void behind. You can also do a beat on the top. So if it's coming here, do what the Germans would call a Zornhau, into their blade, smack onto the top of it, and it opens up the line for the thrust. So, in other words, rather than just parrying or kind of covering yourself, which is one perfectly good option and often the safest and easiest to do, instead you can knock their blade out of the way. And by knocking it out of the way, you stand a very small chance of getting hit in the hand, because what you're doing is you're hitting one moving object with another moving object and knocking it off like a bat with a ball. So to finish off, this is the one possible last reason I want you to think about and discuss. I'm not saying that this is a definite reason, but I think it's worth considering. So this might be controversial, I don't know. But again, I'm not saying that this is definitely a reason, but I've been looking at archaeological remains of bronze swords. And what's very interesting is you often find them with edge damage, like they have smashed into another bronze blade. Now, not to say you don't find iron and steel swords with edge damage, you actually absolutely do. And moreover, in the Bronze Age, this is a problematic topic, because there was a habit for taking bronze swords and, like in King Arthur's tales, casting a sword into a river or a lake or a pool, something like this, for ritualistic religious reasons that we don't fully understand. Equally, sometimes swords were put with human remains, buried or cremated, in order to take into the afterlife, presumably a bit like later sort of Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, Viking era graves. And many of those weapons are ritualistically destroyed or broken. We don't exactly know why, but it was fairly common to break bronze swords, break them up into pieces, and then bury them. Sometimes they were just bent once and thrown into a lake. Sometimes they were literally broken into pieces and then stuck in the ground. And possibly some of the edge damage that we see on these bronze swords, for example, in the Museum of London, was a part and process of this. Perhaps they took a bronze sword, they smashed it up, and then they disposed of it because that was part of the ritual. We don't know. Or it could be from combat. It could be from combat, real combat. It could be from training. We don't really know. But nevertheless, there are bronze swords which have, and spears and all sorts of other things, which have edge damage on them from other weapons. You can clearly see that they are where two blades have smashed into each other. Now, we in the modern world are quite used to using blunt steel training weapons, whether you do reenactment or HEMA or modern Olympic fencing or anything else. Now, blunt steel weapons, I'll just grab another one, blunt steel weapons have a habit of not really biting into each other, okay? They tend to bounce and slide and move around like this, and that is because modern hardened and tempered steel is wonderfully strong, wonderfully resilient, okay? That is not the case, firstly, with sharp blades tend to bite into each other. But if you now imagine a sharp blade that is made of a softer material, they really bite into each other. Now, I'm not going to do that with these lovely replica Bronze Age swords here because I value them greatly and they belonged to an old friend of mine who's no longer with us, unfortunately. So I'm going to treasure these and I'm not going to do this. But I do know people who have done it with Bronze Age swords, and what happens is the blades bite into each other. Now, if you are defending yourself either with the point downwards or the point upwards, and your blades bite into each other, it might be that these blades never really slide down and hit you in the hand, or at least much more rarely, like they do with steel blades, and definitely with blunt steel blades. So the final, possibly, what do you think? Do you think it's maybe, some of you out there I'm sure will go, well yeah, obviously, and others you go, no, bronze can be as hard as iron. There's going to be a spectrum of opinion here, and I am interested to see what your opinions are. And equally, you know, friends of mine like Neil Burridge, who makes these swords, what their opinion is. I think it has a very real effect, not only on the design of the sword and, you know, the cross sections and everything else, but also how the swords are used, because these aren't springy. So if you take a steel sword, it is springy, but it also has an incredibly hard edge. I mean, there's no question for swords, tempered spring steel is just about the best that you can get. But they didn't have that yet. They only have bronze, and bronze is softer, it's obviously less springy, and it is more likely to bite into another blade, which in turn might keep your hands safer and might mean that you don't need such a big crossguard. What do you think? Do you think any of my reasoning here is completely BS, or do you think I'm absolutely on the money, or do you think I've overlooked something? I'll be interested to see what you think down on the comments. As always, I have been Matt Easton, I will continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.